Hello and welcome to my presentation on carbon dating. My name is Benjamin Moore, and in this presentation we will be going over the basics of carbon dating and the implications that it has for us culturally as well as scientifically. Carbon is an element that's very common in our world. It is very prevalent in living organisms especially. And carbon has an atomic number of 6, which indicates the number of protons in its nucleus. Like any element, the number of neutrons in carbon may vary. Carbon is stable when it contains 6 protons and 6 neutrons. When the number of neutrons changes, it is considered unstable and radioactive. The atomic mass number, as indicated here, of carbon is 12.01. This is an average of the isotopes that occur naturally, and the closer it is to 12, the more common 12 is, as we'll see on this next slide here. This is showing us the isotopes of carbon, 3 of which occur naturally and the 4th synthetically in a lab. Carbon-11 has 6 protons and 5 neutrons, and it has a half-life of about 20 minutes, but it doesn't form in the natural world. Carbon-12, as I said, is the most stable form of carbon, and being stable, it doesn't decay to anything, so it doesn't have a half-life. Carbon-13, though not as stable, is still stable enough that it won't decay, but its abundance is only about 1.1% of all carbon atoms in the world. Carbon-14, on the other hand, is considered unstable and will undergo radioactive decay. Carbon-14 has 6 protons and 8 neutrons, and its abundance is 1 part per trillion. So that means for every trillion carbon atoms you collect, only one of them will be carbon-14. So let's talk a little bit about radioactivity. An isotope is considered radioactive if it has an unstable atomic nucleus which emits a form of radiation in order to form a new, more stable nucleus. There are 3 main types of radiation. Alpha radiation is the radiation of a helium nucleus. This happens mostly in larger atoms, which can afford to give away 2 protons and 2 neutrons at a time. Beta radiation is radiation of high-speed electrons. It essentially turns a neutron into a proton. And this is what our carbon-14 atoms are doing as they undergo decay. Gamma radiation is radiation of short electromagnetic waves. So where does carbon-14 originate? Nitrogen is abundant in the atmosphere and is constantly bombarded with radiation and energy from space. And during this bombardment, it'll essentially lose a proton from its nucleus and turn into carbon-14. Carbon-14, as well as carbons 12 and 13, combine with oxygen to form CO2. CO2 is then taken in by plants and enters the carbon cycle. This carbon is used for growth. It enters the food chain as animals eat plants. Our cow here is going to eat this grass, which is just harness this carbon-14 from the atmosphere, and then that carbon-14 will be incorporated into the muscles and bones and other tissues in this organism. And as we eat a good steak from this cow, those carbon-14s will be transferred to us and they'll be incorporated in our bones and in our tissues. So when we have this ratio of carbon 12, 13, and 14, it's relatively constant even throughout all of these steps, and only begins to change after an organism has died. Let's talk about half-life a little bit of carbon-14. A half-life is defined as the amount of time it takes for half of a sample of an isotope to decay. So as we said, carbon 12 and 13, they don't have half-lives because they don't decay. And carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,300 years. So that means after we die, it will take 5,730 years for 50% of our carbon-14 atoms to decay into nitrogen. And looking at this chart here on the right, it only takes 5 or 6 half-lives until we're down below 3 and 1.5% of the carbon that's left. Once we get closer to 50,000 years old, samples tend to not be very productive when trying to date them with carbon-14, in which case they would need to use other forms of radiometric dating, which we will touch on at the end of this presentation. So how does it work? Carbon-12 does not decay, as we said, and carbon-14 decays to form nitrogen-14. So this reduction in the amount of carbon-14 alters the ratio of carbon-12 to 14. This ratio is compared to known levels of living things with consideration of the half-life to determine how old a sample is. And there is math and equations that I could go into, but I won't bore you with those. So what kind of problems or inconsistencies are there in this process? One that is a factor is that the sun is not constant in its radiation output. We don't know, for example, how consistently nitrogen is transformed into carbon in the upper atmosphere, but we can assume that the inconsistency won't significantly affect our data. And some primary species find carbon from other sources rather than from the atmosphere. Modern levels of carbon are also changing rapidly due to industrialization. As we emit carbon into the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels and other things, it skews the levels comparatively to what they were when an organism died maybe 20, 30,000 years ago. So that is why these reasons we have given it has a limit of 50,000 years. So let's get into some more exciting applications of carbon dating, one of which is the relatively recent discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were discovered in 1946 in caves in the Middle East. The Dead Sea Scrolls are an ancient Jewish religious manuscript which contain fragments from every book of the Old Testament except the Book of Esther and Nehemiah. Since then, various labs have tested fragments of these scrolls for carbon dating. On the right side here, we see a chart which shows what scroll was tested, and that's here in the description column. And on the column on the far right, it gives you the age calibrated for the models they're testing and any discrepancies they may have had. So between the various scrolls from the caves that were tested, they found that the range of the age of these scrolls is 400 BCE to 400 CE, with the majority of them falling between 100 BCE and 50 CE. So this makes the scrolls about 2,000 years old. Another exciting application is that of the discovery in King Tut's tomb, which unlocked a lot of treasures for Egypt and its history. And we can safely assume that King Tut's reign ended with his death. Entombed with his body were many sources for testing, including seeds, scrolls, and plant matter, and his sarcophagus itself. Through analysis of the carbon-14 radiometric dating, this dates the end of King Tut's reign at about 3,350 years ago, or approximately 1,340 BCE. So carbon dating allows us to reconstruct history in a way that was not possible before. So carbon is not the only element with unstable isotopes, and the usefulness of these various elements with their isotopes depends on their half-lives. So uranium will deteriorate into lead, but it will only help us to date things that are between 2 million and 2.5 billion years old. So for the purposes of archaeology and cultural studies, it's not very applicable. Not only due to this large time frame, but also living tissues and things that we deal with on a normal basis don't usually have uranium in them. Other models use samarium and neodymium, potassium, argon, rubidium, strontium, and one that is actually rather applicable to us is chlorine-36. Chlorine-36 has a relatively short half-life and allows us to collect data for things that are about 50 years old or less. Specifically, this is used in the water industry to show trends in water contamination and so on. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I hope you have a good day.